If you ever loved someone enough to walk away from them, you'll understand why he couldn't stay another second. Michael Reed kept his head down as he pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the church, the soft hum of voices and distant piano music fading behind him like a life he was never meant to be part of, his hand trembling slightly as it brushed against the cold brass handle. The late afternoon air hitting his face as if reminding him that outside this place, reality was still waiting, still demanding, still unforgiving. And for a moment he just stood there at the top of the stone steps, staring out at the parking lot filled with polished cars that didn't belong to people like him. His worn jacket hanging a little too loose on his shoulders, the faint crease lines in his shirt betraying the fact that it had been folded carefully rather than freshly pressed. And he exhaled slowly, like a man trying to convince himself he had done the right thing by showing up at all, even though every part of him had been screaming to stay home, to stay invisible, to avoid this exact moment where love and regret collided in the worst possible place. Because inside that building, Sophia Bennett was about to marry someone else, and he had no place standing there pretending he was just another guest, pretending his chest didn't feel like it was being quietly pulled apart with every note of the wedding march, pretending he hadn't once imagined a completely different life, where he was the one waiting at the altar instead of hiding near the back row, unnoticed, unimportant, just another shadow passing through a room filled with light. And yet somehow, he came anyway, because 3 days ago a plain white envelope had shown up in his mailbox with no return address. No explanation, just a single line written in careful handwriting that he recognized instantly even after all these years. Please come. And that was all it took. No arguments, no logic, just 2 words that reached into a part of him he thought he had buried for good. The same part that still remembered how her voice sounded when she said his name. The same part that refused to let go even after life had forced them onto separate paths. And now here he was, standing outside a wedding he shouldn't have attended, trying to leave before anyone noticed, before he made things harder than they already were, before he allowed himself to hope for something that didn't belong to him anymore. And as he started down the steps, one slow step after another, his eyes briefly caught a reflection in the glass door behind him, a glimpse of the man he had become, tired, quieter, carrying more than he ever admitted. A single dad doing his best to raise a little girl who deserved more than late nights and early mornings and the constant balancing act of just getting by. And maybe that was the real reason he had walked away from Sophia all those years ago. Not because he didn't love her, but because he believed she deserved something easier, something brighter, something that didn't come with the weight he carried. And now she had it. A beautiful ceremony, a future that made sense, a life that didn't include him. And he told himself again that leaving was the right thing, that disappearing quietly was the only thing he had control over. But just as his foot touched the last step and he reached for the quiet escape waiting beyond the parking lot, something inside him hesitated, just for a second, as if the story wasn't quite finished yet, as if there was still something he hadn't seen, something he hadn't understood, something that hadn't been said out loud. And without knowing why, he slowed down, his fingers curling slightly at his sides, the sound of the church doors creaking open behind him barely noticeable at first, but enough to make his heart skip in a way he couldn't explain, because some part of him knew, even before he turned around, that leaving might not be as simple as he thought. Michael did not turn around right away, even though every instinct in his body told him exactly who might be standing behind him, his shoulders stiffening slightly as the soft sound of the church doors closing echoed across the quiet space outside. And for a moment he convinced himself it could be anyone, another guest stepping out for air, a late arrival, someone who had nothing to do with him at all. But then he heard it, the faint rhythm of footsteps that slowed as they got closer, careful, almost hesitant, like someone who was not sure if they should be there either. And his chest tightened in a way that made it hard to breathe evenly, because he recognized that pause, that quiet uncertainty. It was the same feeling he had carried for years, the same unspoken weight that never really left. And he finally closed his eyes for a brief second before turning around, not fully, just enough to catch a glimpse over his shoulder. And there she was, Sophia Bennett, standing just a few feet away in a dress that looked exactly the way he had imagined it would, and yet somehow nothing like it at all, because it was not the fabric or the design that caught him off guard. It was her expression, The way her smile did not quite reach her eyes. The way her fingers were lightly gripping the edge of her bouquet, as if she needed something to hold on to. And for a second neither of them said anything. The air between them filled with everything they had never finished saying years ago, everything that had been left behind without closure, and Michael forced himself to look away first, his jaw tightening as he nodded slightly, like he was acknowledging a stranger instead of the person who once knew him better than anyone else. And he took a small step back, already preparing to continue walking, to end this moment before it had the chance to turn into something more. Because he knew himself well enough to understand that staying even 1 minute longer could undo all the careful distance he had built. But, just as he shifted his weight, ready to leave, Sophia spoke, her voice softer than he remembered, but steady enough to stop him in place. She said his name in a way that felt both familiar and completely new at the same time. Michael. And it was not loud, not urgent, but it carried something deeper, something that made it impossible to ignore. And he paused again, his back still partially turned, his hand hanging at his side like he had forgotten what he was about to do. And she took a small step closer, close enough now that he could hear the subtle tremble in her breathing. And when she spoke again, her words were quiet, almost like a secret meant only for him. You were really going to leave. Without looking at me. And there was no accusation in her tone, no anger, just a kind of honesty that made it harder to walk away than any argument ever could. And slowly, reluctantly, he turned to face her fully this time, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since he walked into that church. And everything he had tried to keep buried came rushing back in an instant. The memories, the questions, the version of himself he used to be before life reshaped everything. And he swallowed hard, trying to find the right words, something simple, something safe, but nothing felt right. So he settled for the truth he could manage. I did not think it was my place. And Sophia held his gaze for a moment longer than expected, her expression shifting slightly, not surprised, not hurt, just understanding in a way that made his chest feel heavier, and she nodded faintly before glancing back toward the church doors for a brief second, as if aware that time was still moving forward inside, that the world had not paused for this moment. And yet she stayed, standing right in front of him as if this conversation mattered more than anything waiting behind her. And when she looked back at him again, there was something different in her eyes now, something more certain, more resolved, and she took one more step closer, lowering her voice just enough that it felt like the rest of the world had disappeared, and she said quietly, "Then just look at me now." Michael felt the words settle into him in a way he was not prepared for, as if they had weight, as if they carried something far beyond a simple request. And for a moment he did not move, did not speak. He just looked at her, really looked this time. Not the quick glance from across a crowded room or the careful avoidance he had practiced since walking in, but fully, taking in every detail he had tried so hard to ignore. The way a loose strand of her hair had slipped free near her temple, the faint shimmer in her eyes that did not quite match the composed smile she had worn earlier, the subtle rise and fall of her breathing that told him she was just as affected by this moment as he was. And it made something inside him shift, something he had locked away for years without realizing how fragile that lock really was. And he found himself searching her expression for answers he did not know how to ask out loud. Because nothing about this felt simple. Nothing about this felt like closure. It felt unfinished, like a sentence that had been cut off in the middle and left waiting all this time. And he exhaled slowly, his voice quieter now, stripped of the guarded edge he had been holding on to. "Sophia, look." But the words did not come easily, because saying she looked beautiful felt too small, too expected, and saying anything more felt dangerous, like stepping into something he might not be able to step back out of. So he stopped himself, shaking his head slightly as if to reset the moment. And she noticed, of course she did, because she always noticed the things he tried not to say, and a faint, almost bittersweet smile touched her lips, not because she found it amusing, but because she understood, she always had. And for a brief second neither of them spoke again, the silence stretching just enough to become meaningful instead of awkward. And then from somewhere inside the church, a soft swell of music began to rise again, a reminder that time had not paused for them, that there were people waiting, expectations in motion, a ceremony about to continue. And Michael's eyes flickered toward the doors instinctively, that familiar urge to step away returning, to put distance between himself and something that was beginning to feel too real, too complicated. But before he could act on it, Sophia spoke again, her voice still gentle but firmer now, like she had made a decision she was not going to back away from. "Do you know why I asked you to come?" And the question caught him off guard, because he had spent the last 3 days telling himself it did not matter, that it was probably nothing, that maybe she had invited everyone from the past out of courtesy, that reading into it would only make things harder, and yet hearing her ask it directly made it impossible to pretend anymore. And he hesitated, his brow tightening slightly as he answered honestly, "No, I do not." And she nodded slowly, as if she had expected that, her gaze dropping for just a second before returning to him with a clarity that made his chest tighten again. And she took a small breath, steadying herself, and said, "I needed you to see something." And the way she said it was not dramatic, not rushed, it was calm, deliberate, like she had held on to that sentence for a long time, waiting for the right moment to say it. And Michael felt a quiet tension build in his chest, not fear exactly, but anticipation, the kind that comes when you sense that something important is about to change, even if you do not yet understand how. And he glanced once more toward the church, then back at her, his voice low, uncertain. "See what?" And Sophia did not answer right away. Instead she shifted slightly, turning her head just enough to look past him toward the side of the steps. And he followed her gaze without thinking, his eyes landing on a small figure standing near the railing, a little girl no older than 5 or 6, wearing a simple dress and holding onto the metal bar with both hands, watching them quietly. And at first it did not register as anything unusual, just a child waiting, maybe a relative of the bride or groom. But then the girl tilted her head slightly, and something about that small, familiar gesture made his breath catch, something subtle but unmistakable. And before he could process it fully, Sophia's voice came again, softer now, almost like she was afraid of breaking the moment. "Just keep looking." And Michael did, his focus narrowing on the child as a strange, unexplainable feeling began to rise in his chest, something that did not have words yet, something that made the world around him fade just a little as he tried to understand why this felt so important, why this moment felt like it was about to change everything he thought he knew. Michael's eyes stayed fixed on the little girl as if something invisible was slowly pulling him closer, not physically but somewhere deeper, somewhere he did not fully understand yet. And the more he looked, the more the small details began to settle into place in a way that made his chest feel tight. The way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, the way her fingers tapped lightly against the railing when she thought no one was watching, the way her eyes moved with a quiet awareness that felt far too familiar. And he swallowed slowly, his mind trying to make sense of a feeling that arrived before logic could catch up, because it was not recognition in the usual sense, it was something instinctive, something that did not ask for permission before making itself known. And he took a small step forward without realizing he had moved, his voice lower now, almost careful. "Who is that?" And even as he asked the question, part of him already sensed that the answer would not be simple, that it would not fit into the version of reality he had been holding on to for years. And beside him, Sophia did not rush to respond. She watched him instead, as if this moment mattered more than any explanation she could give, as if she needed him to arrive at the edge of understanding on his own before she said anything that would push him over it. And the silence stretched just enough to make his thoughts louder, more insistent, until finally she spoke, her voice steady but softer than before. "Her name is Lily." And the name landed gently, but it did not feel light, it carried weight, meaning, something layered beneath the surface, and Michael repeated it under his breath without meaning to. "Lily." As if saying it might help him understand why it felt so familiar, why it echoed somewhere deep inside him. And the little girl looked up at that exact moment, her eyes meeting his from across the short distance. And she did not look away immediately like most children would when caught staring. Instead she held his gaze with a quiet curiosity, tilting her head slightly in that same small gesture that had already unsettled him once. And something inside him shifted again, stronger this time, undeniable. And he felt his breath catch as memories he had not visited in years brushed against the present, fragments of the past overlapping with what he was seeing now. And he shook his head faintly, as if trying to clear it, trying to ground himself in something logical, something safe. But it was getting harder to ignore the way his heart was reacting, the way every instinct he had was telling him that this moment mattered more than he was ready for. And he glanced back at Sophia, searching her face for something that would steady him, some explanation that would bring this back into focus. And what he found instead was a calm certainty, not hesitation, not fear, just the quiet strength of someone who had already faced this truth long before he had the chance to. And his voice came out slower now, more cautious. Why does she feel like? But he stopped himself, because finishing that sentence felt too dangerous, like stepping across a line he could not uncross. And Sophia took a small breath, her eyes softening slightly as she looked at him. And she stepped just a little closer, close enough that her words would not carry beyond the space between them. Because some things do not disappear just because time passes. And the way she said it was not meant to confuse him. It was meant to guide him, gently, without forcing him to accept anything before he was ready. And Michael felt that tension rise again, sharper now, mixed with something else he had not expected, hope, fragile and uncertain. But they're all the same. And he looked back at the little girl once more, his focus narrowing as if he was seeing her more clearly with every passing second. The shape of her smile, the way she stood, even the quiet patience in the way she waited without calling out. And it hit him then, not all at once, but enough to make his chest tighten and his thoughts falter. Because this was no longer just a question, it was a realization beginning to take form. And he did not know if he was ready for what it might mean, but he could not look away anymore. Michael felt the realization forming before he was ready to accept it, like a truth rising slowly to the surface no matter how hard he tried to keep it buried. And his eyes stayed locked on the little girl, as his thoughts struggled to catch up with what his instincts already understood, because there was something undeniable in the way she looked at him, not just curiosity, not just the quiet attention of a child watching strangers, but something deeper, something that felt almost like recognition. And his chest tightened as he took another small step forward, barely aware of the movement, his voice unsteady now, softer than before. Sophia, what are you trying to tell me? And even as he asked, he already knew this was not a simple answer, not something that could be explained in a single sentence without changing everything that came after it. And beside him, Sophia did not look away this time. She held his gaze with a calm steadiness that made it clear she had been waiting for this moment. Not just today, but for years. And she took a slow breath as if grounding herself before speaking, her voice quiet but unwavering. I am not trying to tell you anything you cannot see for yourself. And that answer should have frustrated him, should have made him press harder, demand clarity. But instead it made his heart race, because it meant the truth was already there, already visible, and all he had to do was accept it. And he turned back toward the little girl again, his mind replaying every detail, every small movement, every expression. And suddenly the pieces began to align in a way that made it impossible to ignore. The way she tilted her head, the way her eyes held on to his just a second longer than expected, even the way she stood with that quiet patience. And a memory surfaced without warning, something small but vivid, a moment from years ago when Sophia had laughed and said that if she ever had a daughter, she hoped she would be calm, observant, someone who noticed the little things. And the thought hit him harder than he expected, because standing there now, that was exactly what he was seeing, and his breath caught as the weight of it settled deeper, and he shook his head slightly, not in denial, but in disbelief at how something so important could have existed without him knowing, without him being there. And his voice came out almost like a whisper, how long? And this time Sophia answered without hesitation, because this was not a question she needed to think about. 5 years, and the number landed heavily, not because it was surprising, but because it filled in the final space he had been avoiding. And he closed his eyes for a brief second, the timeline falling into place in a way that made his chest ache, because 5 years ago was not just any point in the past. It was the exact moment everything had changed. The moment he had walked away believing he was doing the right thing, believing he was giving her a better future, and now he stood here realizing that in trying to protect her, he had missed something that could have changed his entire life. And he opened his eyes again, his gaze returning to the little girl, Lily. And this time the name felt different, no longer just a name, but something personal, something that connected to him in a way he could not ignore. And as if she sensed the shift, Lily let go of the railing and took a small step forward, her expression still calm but curious, and she looked up at Sophia briefly before looking back at him. And in that moment, everything else faded. The church, the music, the expectations waiting inside. None of it mattered the way this did, and Michael felt something inside him break open, not in a painful way, but in a way that made room for something he had not allowed himself to feel in years, something fragile and overwhelming at the same time, and he did not know what to say, did not know how to respond to something this big, this unexpected, but he knew one thing for certain: he was no longer thinking about leaving. Michael stood there without moving, as if even the smallest step might break whatever fragile moment had just formed between him and the truth he had not seen coming. His eyes fixed on Lily as she slowly walked closer, each small step careful but unafraid, and the distance between them, just a few feet now, felt heavier than anything he had carried in years, because it was not just space, it was time. 5 years of absence. 5 years of missed mornings and quiet goodnights and moments he would never get back. And he swallowed hard, his throat tight as he tried to steady his breathing, his mind racing with questions he did not yet have the courage to ask out loud. And Lily stopped a short distance in front of him, close enough now that he could see the details he had missed before, the soft curve of her cheeks, the way her eyes reflected the light. And something in his expression must have shifted because she looked at him with a kind of calm focus that did not belong to someone her age. And for a second neither of them spoke, the silence stretching in a way that was not uncomfortable but deeply meaningful, like both of them were trying to understand something without words. And then Lily tilted her head slightly again, that same small gesture that had unsettled him from the beginning, and she asked in a quiet, clear voice, "Are you the one Mom was waiting for?" And the question landed gently but with undeniable weight, and Michael felt his chest tighten as he glanced briefly at Sophia, who stood just behind Lily now, watching them with a mixture of emotion and restraint, as if she was giving this moment to them, allowing it to unfold without stepping in too quickly. And he looked back at Lily, his voice softer than he expected, careful, almost unsure. I think I might be." And the words felt incomplete, but they were honest. And Lily studied him for a second longer before giving a small nod, as if that answer made sense to her in a way that did not require further explanation. And she took one more step forward, closing the gap just enough that he could feel the presence of her standing there. Real, undeniable, and he hesitated, his hands slightly unsure at his sides, because he did not know what the right action was, did not know if he had the right to reach out, to bridge a distance that had existed her entire life. And before he could decide, Lily did something simple that made everything else fade for a moment. She reached out and gently took his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his as if it was the most natural thing in the world, and the contact was light, almost tentative, but it sent something through him that he could not put into words, something that felt like recognition, like connection, like a missing piece, settling into place without needing permission. And he looked down at their hands, his breath catching slightly as the reality of it settled deeper, and behind them, the music from inside the church grew louder again, signaling that the ceremony was continuing. That time was still moving forward whether they were ready or not, and Michael felt a familiar pressure return, the awareness that decisions were waiting, that this moment would not stay suspended forever, and he lifted his gaze to Sophia again, his voice low but steadier now. "Why did you not tell me?" And there was no anger in the question, only confusion, only the weight of something that could have changed everything if he had known sooner. And Sophia met his gaze without hesitation, her answer coming quietly but firmly. "Because you left believing it was the only way to do the right thing, and I was not going to take that away from you until you were ready to see what you had left behind." And her words did not accuse him, they did not blame him, they simply laid out a truth that he could not argue with. And Michael felt that truth settle into him, heavy but clear, and for the first time since stepping outside those church doors, he was not thinking about escape. He was thinking about what came next, about what it meant to stay. Michael tightened his fingers slightly around Lily's small hand, not enough to hold her in place, just enough to confirm that she was real and not something his mind had created to fill the silence he had been living with for years. And for a moment he could not move because everything inside him was trying to catch up at once, the past he thought he had left behind, the present standing right in front of him. and the future he had never allowed himself to imagine, and Lily looked up at him. With that same quiet focus, her eyes steady in a way that felt far beyond her age, and he slowly lowered himself down to one knee, so he would not be looking down at her anymore, so he could meet her where she was, and his voice came out softer than anything he had said all day. "Hi, Lily." And this time when he said her name, it did not feel like something new. It felt like something that had always been waiting for him to say it, and she gave a small, natural smile, not shy, not overly excited. Just warm, like she had already decided he was someone she could trust. "Hi," she answered, and the simplicity of it made his chest tighten in a way he could not explain, because there was no hesitation in her voice, no distance, just openness, and he found himself studying her face. Again, not searching anymore, just taking in the details he would have memorized years ago if he had known. The way her expression shifted slightly when she listened, the way her eyes stayed focused, and he let out a slow breath, trying to steady himself. "Did your mom tell you I was coming?" he asked gently, and Lily nodded once. "She said someone important might be here," she replied, and that word important settled into him heavier than anything else, because he had spent so long believing he was not part of this story anymore, and yet here he was, being described in a way he had not earned but somehow still belonged to. And he glanced up briefly at Sophia, who stood just a few steps away, watching them with quiet emotion, not interrupting, not guiding, just letting the moment unfold the way it was meant to. And when he looked back at Lily, his voice lowered even more, almost like he was speaking to himself as much as to her. "Do you know who I am?" And Lily tilted her head slightly again, thinking, not confused, just careful, and then she said, "I think so." And that answer, simple as it was, carried more weight than certainty would have, because it meant she was meeting him halfway, not demanding clarity, not needing everything to be defined in one moment, just allowing it to be what it was. And Michael felt something inside him soften completely, the last of the walls he had built over the years starting to fall away without resistance, and he gave a small, almost disbelieving smile. "That is fair," he said quietly, and Lily took a tiny step closer, still holding his hand, her grip a little more secure now, and she asked in that same calm voice, "Are you going to stay this time?" And the question was different from before, deeper, more specific, and it reached him in a place he could not ignore, because it was not about the wedding anymore. It was about presence, about whether he would be someone who stayed or someone who disappeared again, and he felt the weight of that choice settle into him fully, not overwhelming, but real, and he lifted his gaze to Sophia one more time, seeing in her eyes not expectation, but hope carefully held back, and when he looked back at Lily, his answer came without hesitation, steady and clear in a way he had not felt in years. "Yeah," he said softly. "I am not going anywhere." And this time, when Lily smiled, it was just a little brighter, just enough to let him know that something had shifted not only in him, but in her too. And as Michael stood up slowly, still holding her hand, he realized that for the first time since he walked away all those years ago, he was no longer trying to leave, he was finally choosing to stay. Michael stood there with Lily's hand still in his, the warmth of it grounding him in a way he had not expected, and for a moment everything else faded into the background. The music inside the church, the distant voices, even the weight of the past that had followed him for years, all of it seemed quieter now, less overwhelming, because something in him had finally shifted from hesitation to clarity, and he glanced toward the open doors of the church again, the soft light spilling out onto the steps, and this time it did not feel like a place he needed to escape from. It felt like a place he needed to walk back into, not for the ceremony, not for appearances, but because there were still things left unfinished, and he looked down at Lily, his voice calm but steady. "Would you walk in with me?" And she nodded without hesitation, as if the answer had always been yes, and together they turned toward the doors, their steps slow but certain, and as they moved forward, Michael became aware of Sophia walking beside them now, not leading, not following, just there, close enough that he could feel her presence again, familiar and steady, and for a brief second their eyes met, and nothing needed to be said because everything important had already been understood, and as they stepped inside, the soft music grew clearer, the guests seated in neat rows turning slightly as the doors opened, their attention shifting with quiet curiosity. But Michael did not focus on them. he kept his attention forward, on the path ahead, on the small hand still holding his, and on the quiet certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. And as they moved down the aisle, something unexpected happened. The officiant paused. The music softened, and the room seemed to hold its breath, not in confusion, but in recognition that something unplanned was unfolding, something real, and Michael felt the weight of every step, not heavy, but meaningful, each one carrying him further away from the man who had once walked away and closer to the man he was choosing to be now. And when they reached the front, he stopped, not because he was unsure, but because this was the moment where everything came together, and he looked at Sophia, really looked at her, not as someone from his past, but as someone standing in his present, and he spoke quietly, his voice steady enough to carry but soft enough to remain personal. I thought leaving was the right thing to do, and there was no need to explain further because she understood exactly what he meant, and she gave a small nod, her expression calm but filled with emotion, and he continued, "But I was wrong." And those words were not dramatic, not loud, they were simple, honest, and complete, and for a second the room remained silent, not out of discomfort, but out of respect for something genuine, something that did not need decoration or explanation. And Michael felt Lily's hand tighten slightly in his, a small reminder of why he was standing there, and he glanced down at her before looking back at Sophia, and in that moment, everything felt aligned in a way he had never allowed himself to believe was possible, not perfect, not easy, but real. And as the music slowly began to rise again, softer this time, more reflective than ceremonial, Michael realized that this was not about interrupting anything. It was about finding the truth that had been waiting underneath it all, and for the first time in years, he was no longer trying to understand where he belonged. He already knew. The room remained still for a moment longer, as if everyone present understood that what they were witnessing was not part of any planned ceremony, but something far more meaningful, something that did not need an announcement to be recognized. And Michael stood there with Lily's hand in his and Sophia, just a step away, feeling the quiet weight of a life that had almost passed him by. And for the first time, he did not feel the urge to question it or pull away from it. He simply allowed it to exist, and as the soft music continued in the background, the officiant took a small step back, giving them space without interrupting, and the guests, though curious, remained respectfully silent, their attention drawn not to spectacle, but to sincerity. And Michael glanced down at Lily again, her small fingers still wrapped around his, her presence steady and grounding, and he realized that everything he had been searching for, everything he thought he had lost or never deserved, had been standing quietly in front of him all along, waiting not for perfection, not for the right timing, but simply for him to be ready to see it. And he took a slow breath, his shoulders easing as a calm certainty settled in, the kind that does not come from knowing every answer, but from finally accepting the truth that matters most. And he looked at Sophia again, his voice gentle but clear. "I cannot change the years I missed." And there was no guilt in the way he said it, only honesty, only acknowledgement of something real. And she nodded softly, her eyes steady, understanding without needing reassurance, and he continued, "But I can choose what I do next." And that was where everything shifted, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that demanded applause, but in a quiet, grounded way that felt lasting. And Lily looked up at him as if she understood more than her years suggested, her expression calm but bright, and he gave her hand a small, reassuring squeeze before looking back at Sophia. And for a moment the three of them stood there, not as fragments of a broken past, but as something whole beginning to take shape. And the music softened even further, almost fading into the background completely, as if giving space to the silence that now felt full instead of empty. And Michael felt something settle in his chest, something steady and certain, and he said quietly, "If you are willing, I would like to be here, for both of you." And the words were simple, but they carried everything he had not been able to say before, and Sophia's expression softened in a way that made it clear she had not been waiting for perfection, only for truth, and she nodded once, her voice just above a whisper, "We have been here." And that was all it took, no long explanations, no dramatic declarations, just a shared understanding that what mattered was not what had been lost, but what could still be built. And as the officiant gently resumed the ceremony, adjusting to what had just unfolded rather than ignoring it. Michael did not step back or return to the shadows. He remained where he was, present, steady, and when Lily shifted slightly closer to him, resting against his side with quiet comfort, he realized that staying was no longer a decision he had to think about. It was something that felt natural, something that felt right. And as he looked out across the room briefly, seeing the soft expressions of those watching, he understood that sometimes the most important moments are not the ones planned in advance, but the ones that happen when someone finally chooses not to walk away. And as the music gently rose again, and the ceremony continued in a way that now felt more complete than before, Michael stood there not as a guest passing through, but as someone who had finally found where he belonged, not because everything was perfect, but because he had chosen to stay when it mattered most. As the final notes of the music gently faded into the quiet warmth of the room, nothing felt rushed anymore, nothing felt uncertain, and Michael stood there with Lily leaning softly against him and Sophia beside them, realizing that the life he once thought had passed him by had not disappeared at all. It had simply been waiting for him to be ready to step back into it. And he looked down at Lily, brushing a small strand of hair away from her face in a gesture that came naturally, as if it had always been part of him. And she looked up at him with a quiet trust that did not ask for promises, only presence. And that made something settle deep in his chest, something steady and real. And he lifted his gaze to Sophia, and this time there was no hesitation, no distance, just a calm understanding between them that did not need to be spoken out loud, because everything important had already been said in the choices they were making right now. And he gave a small nod, not as a question, but as a confirmation of something they both felt, and Sophia returned it with a soft smile, one that carried years of patience but no bitterness, only the quiet relief of something finally finding its place. And as people around them began to move again, conversations slowly returning, the world continuing as it always does, Michael realized that this moment was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something he had not allowed himself to imagine before, something that would take time, effort, and honesty, but something that was worth showing up for every single day. And he gently squeezed Lily's hand, and she responded by holding on just a little tighter, and that small, simple connection said more than words ever could. And as they stepped forward together, not toward a perfect future but toward a real one, Michael understood something he had missed for years, that leaving is easy when you are afraid of not being enough, but staying, choosing to be present even when things are uncertain, that is where meaning is found. And for the first time in a long time, he was not walking away from something he cared about. He was walking toward it. And he knew that no matter what came next, he would not disappear again. Because some moments do not ask you to be perfect, they only ask you to stay.